Imagine the shock. Chad, decked out in a flimsy police costume, glaring at me outside the high school gates, spitting out, "This girl isn't safe with someone like you." Before I could blink, he yanked my daughter away like he owned her, all under the watchful eye of Becky Hartwell, our new HOA president. There she stood, arms folded, that smug grin stretching across her face as if she'd orchestrated the whole scene. I don't know how many twisted tales they'd spun about me, but they'd picked the wrong target. I'm not just a single. Dad, I've trained warriors who've marched into chaos and returned with a blueprint for survival. And today, I've got that map in hand. Get ready to see HOAs in a whole new light. My name's Marcus Thompson, and 6 months ago, I figured the toughest part of moving to Springdale Heights would be the property taxes. Boy, was I mistaken. The real challenge turned out to be Rebecca Hartwell and her self-crowned empire of fake power. But let's rewind to the start. This tale takes a dark turn before the dawn breaks. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us. If you have any confrontation with the HOA, we will narrate your story on our channel. It was a Tuesday morning in October when I first saw the red warning sign planted in my front yard like a battle flag. Community standards violation, it screamed in bold letters, contrasting sharply against my blue house. I stood there, in my running gear, coffee mug in hand, studying that sign the way I'd assess a tactical situation. Something about the placement felt deliberate, almost theatrical. My daughter Emma emerged from the house with her professional camera, already documenting what would become evidence in a federal case. At 16, she had inherited her mother's eye for detail and my stubborn streak. She circled the sign, snapping photos from artistic angles, while I scanned the neighborhood for whoever had planted this thing overnight. That's when Becky Hartwell appeared, clipboard in one hand and tablet in the other, followed by a middle-aged man carrying some kind of measuring device. Becky looked like every suburban power tripper you've ever met. Professionally dressed in a black blazer over white blouse, blonde bob perfectly styled, and the kind of cold smile that never reached her eyes. Her companion introduced himself as Bob Chen, HOA secretary, though he avoided eye contact and seemed more interested in his gadgets than conversation. Becky spoke in the complex language of homeowners association bureaucracy, but she kept it conversational enough to seem reasonable. "You understand these regulations protect property values. Your security camera is causing privacy concerns for neighbors," she explained, gesturing toward my front door camera. "And those LED outdoor lights aren't violating any laws, but the HOA has authority over aesthetic standards." The way she emphasized authority made my military instincts kick in. I kept my voice level, explaining that I was a single father who'd lost his wife 3 years ago, still learning the neighborhood rules while raising a teenage daughter. Becky's expression didn't soften an inch. If anything, she seemed to enjoy my explanation. "I'm sure you mean well, Marcus, but good intentions don't excuse violations. You have 72 hours to comply or face a $750 fine." The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge. Emma continued photographing everything, including Becky's reaction to being recorded. I noticed how Becky's professional mask slipped just slightly when she realized she was being documented. As we talked, Dr. Jessica Park walked by with her 12-year-old son heading to their car for the morning school run. Becky immediately shifted into friendly neighbor mode, waving enthusiastically and calling out about neighborhood solidarity and working together for everyone's benefit. The contrast was jarring, one moment delivering ultimatums, the next playing community cheerleader. Jessica looked uncomfortable, but nodded politely before hurrying her son along. I filed that interaction away, sensing there was more to the neighborhood dynamics than met the eye. Something about Becky's performance felt rehearsed, like she'd done this before. That evening, Emma and I sat in my home office reviewing footage from our security system. What we discovered made my blood run cold. For the past 2 weeks, members of the HOA Council had been conducting surveillance on our house. The cameras had captured Becky, Chad, and Bob Chen taking photos, measuring distances, and even testing sight lines from neighboring properties. But the most disturbing clip came from 3 nights ago. Becky on her phone in front of our house, and if you read her lips carefully, she was saying, "Sarah Thompson, my dead wife's name." Emma paused the video at that exact frame, and we both stared at the screen in silence. Why would they be talking about Sarah? She'd never lived in this neighborhood, never even visited Springdale Heights. The only connection I could think of was her job at the development firm in Chester County. But that was 3 years ago. I felt that familiar sensation from my military days. The moment when you realized you're not facing a random encounter, but a planned operation. Emma must have sensed my shift in mood because she looked up from her laptop with concerned eyes. "Dad, this isn't normal HOA stuff, is it?" I shook my head, already planning our next moves. "No, sweetheart. This is something else entirely." As I watched the surveillance footage loop, showing Becky clearly articulating my wife's name, I knew we were dealing with someone who had done their homework on our family. The question was why and how deep this rabbit hole went. That night, I called my commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell, and requested a background check on Rebecca Hartwell. If she knew about Sarah, there was a connection I needed to understand. Emma, meanwhile, had already started her own digital investigation, pulling up social media profiles and public records with the efficiency of someone who'd grown up with technology. We were approaching this from different angles, but both of us sensed we were walking into something bigger than property violations and neighborhood politics. Becky Hartwell had made this personal by invoking Sarah's memory, and that was a line she shouldn't have crossed. The next morning, I implemented what the military calls counter-surveillance. While Emma got ready for school, I set up an observation post at my second-floor window using field binoculars to monitor the street. Old habits die hard, and after 15 years training special operations soldiers, you develop an instinct for spotting threats before they spot you. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions about our new neighbor's true intentions. Chad Morrison appeared at 0800 hours, driving what looked like an official patrol vehicle, complete with emergency lights and HOA security decals. He was a pudgy man in his late 30s, wearing a uniform that screamed security theater, all the accessories of authority, with none of the legitimacy. For the next hour, he conducted what he probably thought was professional surveillance, circling our block and stopping to take notes. From my vantage point, I could see him checking a clipboard and speaking into a radio, playing the part of official law enforcement. The performance would have been laughable if it wasn't so concerning. This wasn't random harassment. This was organized intimidation with props and procedure. Meanwhile, Emma had her multiple monitors running, tracking digital footprints like a teenage detective. Her computer skills had always impressed me, but today she was operating on another level entirely. "Dad, you need to see this," she called from her room. I found her surrounded by browser windows displaying social media profiles, LinkedIn, histories, and public record searches. What she'd discovered made the blood drain from my face. Becky Hartwell's professional history showed she'd worked at Keystone Development Group in Chester County, the same company where Sarah had been employed as a project manager. The timeline matched exactly. Becky was there during Sarah's final months when my wife had started coming home, stressed about workplace politics and a problematic colleague named Rebecca. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Sarah had mentioned Rebecca several times, always in the context of questionable business practices and ethical concerns. My wife had been considering reporting financial irregularities she'd discovered, but the stress of the situation had been wearing on her. The workplace harassment had contributed to her exhaustion, her late nights, her distracted driving. I'd never connected her work stress to the accident that took her life, but now I was seeing a direct line between Becky's past behavior and my family's tragedy. Emma continued clicking through cached web pages, finding references to a Becky Hartwell PR scandal in Chester County that had apparently been scrubbed from most sites. Dr. Jessica Park's experience that week confirmed Becky was running a systematic campaign. Jessica stopped me during my evening run, looking nervous and apologetic. "Marcus, I feel terrible about this, but Becky approached me about your family. She mentioned concerns about your PTSD and single parenting situation. I told her I barely knew you, but she seemed to think I should be worried about Emma's welfare." Jessica's discomfort was obvious. As she continued, she asked me to keep an eye on your house and report any concerning behavior. I wanted you to know because it felt wrong. I thanked Jessica for her honesty, recognizing another piece of Becky's strategy. Isolate the target by turning neighbors into unwilling surveillance assets. That same evening, Mrs. Dorothy Chin approached me discreetly at the grocery store. Dorothy was Bob Chin's wife, a silver-haired woman in her mid-60s with sharp, intelligent eyes. "We need to talk," she said quietly, glancing around the produce section like we were conducting a covert operation. "Not here, not now, but soon. There are things about Rebecca Hartwell you need to know, things that connect more than just HOA violation." She handed me a grocery list with her phone number written on the back. "Call me tomorrow evening. And Marcus, your instincts about danger are correct." Before I could ask questions, she disappeared into the frozen foods aisle, leaving me with more questions than answers. Emma's digital investigation yielded another disturbing discovery that night. She'd managed to access cached emails from the HOA server. Technically a minor violation, but one that revealed Becky's true intentions. The emails outlined a plan for a child welfare investigation using fabricated credentials and fake documentation. Emma's face was pale as she showed me the messages between Becky and Chad discussing removal procedures and temporary custody arrangements. This wasn't about property violations or neighborhood aesthetics. This was about taking my daughter away from me using the same systematic harassment tactics that had contributed to Sarah's death. I called Colonel Mitchell immediately, requesting an expedited background check on Rebecca Hartwell and her associates. "Sir, I need to know if we're dealing with someone who's done this before," I explained, giving him the basics without revealing Emma's hacking activities. Mitchell's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many dangerous situations. "Thompson, I'll have preliminary results by tomorrow morning, but if you're sensing a credible threat to your family, trust your training and take appropriate precautions." As I hung up, Emma looked at me with a mixture of excitement and concern. She was treating this like a fascinating puzzle, not fully grasping the potential danger we were facing. But I was beginning to understand that Becky Hartwell wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was someone with a personal vendetta against my family, backed by a network of enablers who either didn't understand her true nature or didn't care. The surveillance, the harassment, the targeting of Emma, it all pointed to someone who had planned this operation carefully and was escalating towards something much worse. As Emma continued her digital investigation into the night, I realized we were running out of time to stay ahead of whatever Becky had planned next. The ghost of my wife's past had come back to haunt us. And this time, I wasn't going to let it destroy what was left of my family. Dorothy Chen's basement looked like a miniature FBI operations center, complete with evidence boards, surveillance photos, and carefully organized case files. When she invited me over the next evening, I expected a concerned neighbor conversation, not a full-scale intelligence briefing. Emma accompanied me, bringing her laptop and camera, drawn by the mystery like a moth to flame. Dorothy moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to serious investigative work. And when she began explaining her background, everything started making sense. I spent 25 years as an FBI behavioral analyst before retirement, Dorothy explained, pointing to photos of Becky taken over several months. When Rebecca Hartwell became HOA president, something about her patterns triggered my professional instincts, so I started documenting. The evidence board showed a timeline of Becky's activities, but the most disturbing section focused on a missing person case from Pennsylvania. Thomas Wright, a 62-year-old man who disappeared after challenging Becky's authority at his previous HOA. Thomas threatened to expose financial irregularities. 2 weeks later, he vanished. Rebecca moved to Ohio immediately afterward. The Sarah connection hit me like a physical blow. Dorothy had obtained employment records showing that my wife had filed formal complaints about Rebecca Hartwell's conduct in the months before her death. Your wife discovered Rebecca was embezzling from homeowner association accounts. Sarah was preparing to report it to law enforcement when Rebecca retaliated with workplace harassment designed to discredit her. The timeline was brutal. Sarah's stress levels had increased dramatically during her final months, corresponding exactly with Becky's escalating campaign. My wife had been coming home exhausted and anxious about work situations she couldn't explain. The morning of her accident, she'd been driving to meet with a lawyer about the Rebecca situation. Emma had been quietly processing this information while conducting her own digital investigation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried new maturity that reminded me painfully of Sarah. Dad, Becky's been researching our family for months. Before moving here, she has screenshots of Mum's obituary, photos of our old house, even information about your military service. This isn't random. She specifically chose Springdale Heights because she knew we'd moved here. This whole thing is premeditated revenge. Emma's laptop screen showed cached search results and social media activity, proving that our encounter with Becky wasn't coincidental. Dorothy's assessment was clinical and terrifying. Rebecca exhibits patterns of a malignant narcissist who destroys anyone challenging her authority. Your wife threatened her criminal enterprise. Now you and Emma represent unfinished business. We weren't dealing with neighborhood politics. We were facing someone who had already contributed to one death and was escalating toward another confrontation. The realization that Sarah's workplace stress had been weaponized harassment, contributing to the distraction that cost her life, filled me with cold fury I hadn't felt since combat operations. Colonel Mitchell called while we were still absorbing Dorothy's revelations, his voice carrying unusual urgency. "Thompson, Rebecca Hartwell has a sealed juvenile record restraining orders for stalking, and she's been in contact with private security contractors who specialize in problem resolution. Treat this as a credible threat to your family's safety." I thanked Mitchell and hung up, feeling operational planning instincts taking over. This had moved beyond harassment into active threat assessment, and my family was clearly in the crosshairs of someone with resources and willingness to escalate to violence. Emma's continued investigation during our conversation revealed even more disturbing intelligence. Dad, Dorothy, Chad Morrison, has connections to Secure Max Incorporated, a company sued for civil rights violations and illegal detention, and I found floor plans of our house in his cloud storage. The violation of privacy was disturbing, but the implications were worse. They weren't just planning harassment. They were planning something that required detailed knowledge of our home's layout. The systematic nature of their preparation suggested we were facing people who had done this before and had refined their methods through practice. As we prepared to leave Dorothy's house, she handed me a thick folder containing everything she'd collected. "Marcus, I'm contacting the Bureau tomorrow morning. This is moved beyond HOA harassment into potential federal crimes, conspiracies, stalking across state lines, and possibly accessory to homicide in Thomas Wright's case." She paused, looking every inch the seasoned investigator she'd once been. "But Rebecca doesn't know we've connected these dots yet." That gives us a brief advantage. And in cases like this, timing is everything. The drive home was silent, except for Emma's typing as she continued researching. When we pulled into our driveway, Chad's patrol car was parked across the street, engine running, occupant watching. The surveillance had become overt. Emma noticed the surveillance too, reflexively documenting everything through her passenger window. "Dad, whatever they're planning, I think it's going to happen soon." The pattern suggests they're moving into the final phase. I looked at my 16-year-old daughter, simultaneously proud of her analytical skills and terrified that she was having to use them in this situation. But Emma was right about the timing, the surveillance, the escalating harassment, the research into our family. It all pointed to an end game that was approaching faster than I'd anticipated. The ghost of my wife's past had returned to haunt us. And this time, I wasn't going to let it destroy what remained of my family. Thursday morning started like any other day, except for the sensation that we were being watched from multiple angles. Emma had school. I had training exercises at the base, and neither of us mentioned the electric tension that had been building for days. As I drove Emma to Springdale High, I noticed the same black SUV that had been parked on various streets near our house all week. The occupants were trying to be discreet, but after years of teaching surveillance detection to special forces operators, their amateur hour tactics were painfully obvious. Emma kissed my cheek before getting out of the car, but her goodbye carried extra weight. "Dad, I've got my phone with location tracking enabled, and I set up an automatic live stream to a private account if I activate emergency mode, just in case." At 16, my daughter was thinking like a counterintelligence operative, and the fact that she felt it necessary broke my heart. I watched her walk through the school entrance, noting the security cameras and exit points out of habit. Everything about this felt like the calm before a storm that was about to break over our family. The call came at 11:47 in the morning while I was running training scenarios with a group of Green Beret candidates. My phone buzzed with Emma's emergency signal, followed immediately by a text message. "Fake CPS here, going with them to avoid scene, track my location, trust me." My blood turned to ice as I realized Becky had finally made her move. I excused myself from the training exercise and called the school's main office only to be told that Child Protective Services had arrived with proper documentation to remove Emma Thompson for a welfare evaluation. The administrator sounded apologetic, but insisted everything appeared legitimate. I broke every speed limit getting back to Springdale Heights, calling Colonel Mitchell on the way to report a potential kidnapping in progress. "Sir, I need immediate federal assistance. My daughter has been taken by individuals impersonating government officials." Mitchell's response was swift and professional. "Thompson, I'm contacting FBI immediately. Do not engage suspects alone." This could be the break we need to bring down this entire operation. But as I raced through traffic, my military training warred with my parental instincts. Every fiber of my being screamed to find Emma and eliminate the threat, while my operational experience warned against rash action that could make things worse. Dorothy Chen was waiting in my driveway when I arrived, her face grim with determination. "Marcus, I've been monitoring police frequencies and tracking Emma's phone signal. She's at Chad Morrison's property on the outskirts of town, and I've already contacted my FBI contacts with the coordinates." Dorothy's efficiency was remarkable, but what impressed me most was Emma's foresight. My daughter had activated not just location tracking, but also continuous audio recording, sending everything to a secure cloud account that Dorothy could access. Through Emma's hidden microphone, we could hear Becky and Chad discussing their next moves with chilling, casual cruelty. The Thompson girl is smart, but she doesn't understand what she's dealing with. Becky's voice came through clearly on Dorothy's laptop speakers. Her father thinks his military training makes him special, but he's about to learn what real power looks like in civilian life. By tomorrow, he'll be facing federal charges for interfering with a child welfare investigation, and Emma will be in state custody where she belongs. Chad's response was equally disturbing. What about the old lady next door? She's been asking too many questions. Becky's laugh was cold and calculating. Dorothy Chen won't be a problem much longer. Some people need to learn when to mind their own business. While we listened to the conversation, Emma was proving she'd inherited both her mother's intelligence and my tactical thinking. Through the audio feed, we could hear her asking innocuous questions that prompted Becky and Chad to reveal crucial information about their operation. "Why did you really move to Springdale Heights?" Emma asked with teenage curiosity. Honey, your father destroyed someone very important to me," Becky replied, clearly enjoying the opportunity to explain her cleverness. "Sarah Thompson thought she could ruin my career and steal my future. So I made sure she paid for her interference, and now it's your father's turn to lose everything he cares about." The confession was exactly what Dorothy needed to activate federal intervention. As she coordinated with FBI agents while monitoring Emma's situation, I struggled with the hardest decision of my military career: trust the system to save my daughter or take direct action that could jeopardize the larger investigation. Emma made the choice for me by sending another text. "Dad, I'm recording everything. They're planning to move me tonight. Dorothy's people need time to get here. Trust the plan." My 16-year-old was conducting her own intelligence operation while in hostile custody, showing courage that would have impressed even my most experienced operators. By late afternoon, FBI agents were coordinating with Dorothy from an unmarked van parked 2 blocks from Chad's property. The audio surveillance from Emma's phone had provided probable cause for federal intervention, and agents were preparing for a coordinated rescue operation. But Becky and Chad had noticed increased activity in the neighborhood and were making preparations to relocate Emma to a secondary location. "We need to move now." Becky's voice carried new urgency through the audio feed. "The Thompson situation needs to be resolved permanently before anyone else gets involved." Chad's response chilled me to the bone. "I've got the van ready and the secondary location prepared. No one will find her there." As federal agents moved into position around Chad's property, I received final permission from the operation commander to participate in Emma's rescue. My daughter had managed to unlock her restraints using techniques she'd apparently learned from online tutorials, and she was preparing to create a distraction when agents breached the building. Through her phone's microphone, we could hear her speaking directly to us. "Dad, I'm okay, and I'm ready. When this is over, we're going to make sure they never hurt another family." Emma's voice carried a strength and determination that reminded me exactly why I was so proud to be her father and why Becky Hartwell had made the mistake of underestimating both of us. The FBI tactical team moved like shadows through Chad Morrison's property while Emma continued providing real-time intelligence through her concealed audio feed. Agent Sarah Williams, the operation commander, had positioned me with the secondary team, recognizing that my daughter's safety took priority over my desire to personally apprehend the suspect. Through Dorothy's laptop, we monitored Emma's situation. As she implemented an escape plan that would have impressed my most creative special operations students. "Dad, I'm about to make noise," Emma whispered into her hidden microphone. "Chad's getting a call from Becky about moving me to location 2. I found bolt cutters in the garage and I'm cutting my zip ties now." The sound of metal cutting through. Plastic came through clearly, followed by Emma's careful movement around the interior of Chad's garage workshop. My daughter had spent the past 6 hours turning her kidnapping into an intelligence-gathering operation, systematically documenting a criminal conspiracy far larger than we'd initially suspected. Emma's hacking of Chad's phone had revealed GPS coordinates that made Dorothy Chen's face pale with recognition. "That's where Thomas Wright's body is buried," Dorothy said grimly, showing the FBI agents satellite imagery of the remote location. The digital evidence was devastating. Financial records showing embezzlement from multiple HOA accounts across 3 states, communication with hired criminals, and detailed plans for eliminating anyone who threatened Becky's operations. Within hours, federal agents confirmed Wright's remains at the exact coordinates Emma had discovered, transforming our case into a federal murder investigation. Agent Williams received confirmation of the discovery just as the tactical situation escalated. "This is now a federal murder investigation," Williams announced. "All units be advised. Suspects are considered armed and extremely dangerous." But Emma's audio feed revealed that Becky and Chad were becoming increasingly paranoid about law enforcement activity in the area. "Something's wrong." Chad's voice carried panic through the speakers. "There are too many unmarked vehicles in the neighborhood. We need to abort and activate the emergency protocol." Becky's response was chilling in its casual cruelty. "Fine. Eliminate the Thompson problem permanently and we'll disappear tonight." The tactical situation changed instantly as agents realized Becky and Chad were preparing to harm Emma rather than simply relocate her. "All units execute immediate breach," Agent Williams commanded. "Priority 1 is subject safety." Through the audio feed, we could hear Emma moving toward the garage door she'd quietly unlocked, preparing to meet the rescue team halfway. My daughter's tactical thinking was keeping her alive, while federal agents closed the distance to her. Location. The coordination between Emma's escape attempt and the FBI breach was textbook special operations, and I'd never been more proud or more terrified in my life. Chad Morrison's panic when he discovered Emma's empty restraints provided crucial minutes for the tactical team to establish positions. "She's gone! The girl escaped!" Chad shouted into his radio, followed by Becky's furious response. "Find her now. If she gets away, we're all going to prison forever." But Emma was already moving toward the FBI perimeter, her phone's GPS signal guiding agents to her exact location. When Agent Williams called Package Secure, confirming Emma's safety, I felt 18 years of military training finally pay off in the most important mission of my life. The arrest of Becky Hartwell happened simultaneously at her HOA office, where she was attempting to destroy financial records and computer files. Federal agents found her in the middle of a document shredding operation, desperately trying to eliminate evidence that Emma's investigation had already copied to secure servers. "Rebecca Hartwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, embezzlement, and violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act," Agent Williams announced over the radio. The charges would continue mounting as investigators analyzed the massive amount of evidence Emma had collected during her time in custody. Dr. Jessica Park approached me during the controlled chaos of the FBI operation, her face showing a mixture of relief and shame. "Marcus, I need to apologize. Rebecca threatened my job and my custody of David if I didn't cooperate with her surveillance of your family. I was terrified of losing my son, but I should have warned you sooner about what she was planning." Jessica's admission revealed another layer of Becky's systematic manipulation, using fear and intimidation to turn neighbors into unwilling accomplices. The entire community had been living under a reign of psychological terror, disguised as neighborhood management. When Emma finally emerged from the FBI debriefing, she looked exhausted but determined. My daughter had spent 6 hours conducting counterintelligence operations while in hostile custody, collecting evidence that would put Becky Hartwell away for life. Dad, I got everything. The murder confession, the financial records, the plans. For eliminating other families who might challenge her authority. She's been doing this for years across multiple states. Emma's investigation had uncovered a pattern of criminal behavior that stretched back to Rebecca's college years, revealing someone who had learned to weaponize administrative systems against anyone who opposed her will. As federal agents processed the crime scene and began arresting Becky's network of enablers, I realized that my family had survived something far more dangerous than neighborhood harassment. We'd been targeted by a predator who used legitimate systems of community governance as cover for systematic criminal behavior. But Emma's courage and intelligence had turned the tables, transforming her from victim to the key witness in a federal prosecution that would prevent Becky from harming anyone else. The girl who'd been kidnapped that morning had emerged as the architect of her captor's downfall. And I couldn't have been more proud of the young woman she was becoming. The federal courthouse in downtown Columbus buzzed with media attention as the case against Rebecca Hartwell became national news. Emma sat beside me in the witness section, her testimony having provided the cornerstone evidence for multiple federal charges including conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, embezzlement, and racketeering. My daughter had spent months working with FBI investigators, her digital evidence and recorded confessions forming an airtight case against a criminal enterprise that had operated across 5 states. Agent Williams presented the prosecution's evidence with methodical precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant, Rebecca Hartwell, orchestrated a systematic campaign of harassment, embezzlement, and ultimately murder to maintain control over multiple homeowner associations while stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from the communities she claimed to serve. The presentation showed financial records, communication logs, and GPS data that Emma had collected during her kidnapping, each piece building toward an undeniable conclusion of guilt. Emma's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial, delivered with poise that belied her 17 years. Mrs. Hartwell told me that my mother needed to pay for her interference, and that my father would lose everything he cared about as punishment for my mother's attempt to expose the embezzlement. Emma's voice never wavered as she described systematically documenting confessions while maintaining her cover as a helpless victim. The jury was visibly moved by her courage and intelligence, while Becky sat stone-faced at the defense table, her mask of respectability finally cracking under the weight of evidence. The revelation of Thomas Wright's murder sent shockwaves through the courtroom as prosecutors played audio recordings Emma had captured of Becky discussing the killing with casual indifference. Thomas was becoming a problem that required a permanent solution. Becky's voice echoed through the speakers, followed by detailed discussions of body disposal and evidence destruction. Chad Morrison had already pleaded guilty in exchange for testimony against Becky, admitting his role in Wright's murder and describing how Becky had recruited him through connections to unethical private security contractors. Dorothy Chan's expert testimony provided crucial psychological context about the defendant's methods. Miss Hartwell exhibits classic patterns of a malignant narcissist who weaponizes legitimate authority structures to commit crimes while maintaining plausible deniability. She specifically targets vulnerable individuals and families using systematic harassment to drive them away or destroy them entirely. Dorothy's FBI background lent credibility to her analysis, while her months of surveillance provided documentary evidence of Becky's predatory behavior patterns. The defense's attempts to portray Becky as an overzealous volunteer collapsed when prosecutors revealed the scope of her criminal enterprise. Investigators had traced embezzled funds across multiple states, showing systematic theft that had netted over $400,000 from HOA accounts. The prosecution painted a picture of a serial predator who'd been operating for nearly a decade, moving to new areas whenever her criminal activity attracted attention. Dr. Jessica Park's testimony revealed how Becky had manipulated the entire community through fear and intimidation. She threatened my career and custody of my son if I didn't provide information about the Thompson family. She made everyone feel like they were protecting their families by helping her surveillance efforts. We were all terrified of what would happen if we refused to cooperate. Jessica's account showed how entire communities could become unwilling accomplices when faced with systematic intimidation. The moment of Becky's courtroom breakdown came when prosecutors played the recording of her confession about Sarah Thompson's death. "Your wife thought she could destroy my career and my future." Becky's voice filled the courtroom, followed by her description of the harassment campaign that had contributed to Sarah's fatal accident. She needed to learn that actions have consequences, and now your family is learning the same lesson. When confronted with her own words, Becky finally lost composure, screaming at the jury that she'd been protecting communities from people who didn't belong. When the guilty verdict was announced on all charges, including first-degree murder, for Thomas Wright's death, Becky's final mask of respectability cracked completely. As federal marshals prepared to escort her from the courtroom, she turned toward Emma and me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," she screamed. "You destroyed my life just like your wife destroyed my career." But Agent Williams was ready with additional charges. "Rebecca Hartwell, you're also under arrest for threatening federal witnesses and obstruction of justice." Even in her final moments of freedom, Becky couldn't resist, confirming her guilt through her own actions, providing one last piece of evidence for the prosecution's case. 6 months after Becky Hartwell received a life sentence without possibility of parole, Springdale Heights had transformed into something that actually resembled a healthy community. The old surveillance cameras that had monitored residents for violations were replaced with a community garden where neighbors gathered every weekend to work together and catch up on local news. Emma had installed a new security system for the neighborhood, but this one was designed to protect residents from external threats rather than spy on them for internal violations. Dr. Jessica Park had been elected as the new HOA president on a platform of complete transparency and resident empowerment. The first community meeting under her leadership drew nearly every household eager to participate in governance after months of living under Becky's authoritarian control. The new HOA constitution included a residents' bill of rights, mandatory financial audits, and open book policies that would prevent anyone from consolidating power the way Becky had. "We're not managing a community," Jessica announced during her inaugural address. "We're serving one." Mrs. Dorothy Chen accepted the position of Community Safety Advisor, bringing her FBI experience to bear on legitimate security concerns while respecting residents' privacy and civil rights. The monthly town halls she organized became models for other communities dealing with HOA reform, showing how proper oversight and transparency could prevent the kind of corruption that had flourished under Becky's regime. Dorothy's investigation techniques were now being taught at federal law enforcement training centers as examples of how retired agents could contribute to community safety. Emma and I had officially become consultants for the FBI's new Toxic HOA task force, traveling to communities across the country where residents reported harassment, embezzlement, or abuse of authority by homeowner association officials. My military training in teaching and assessment combined with Emma's digital investigation skills created an effective team for identifying and documenting criminal behavior disguised as community management. We had already helped expose 3 additional criminal enterprises similar to Becky's operation, leading to federal prosecutions and community reform. The Thomas Wright case had been officially closed with Becky's conviction, bringing some measure of peace to his family after years of uncertainty about his fate. The financial restitution from seized assets helped compensate the dozens of families who'd been driven from their homes by Becky's harassment campaigns. Several of those families had moved back to communities they'd been forced to abandon, reclaiming homes and lives that had been stolen by systematic intimidation and abuse of power. Sarah's memory had been honored with a scholarship fund for single parents pursuing education while raising children, administered by a foundation that also supported community organizing efforts and HOA reform initiatives. Emma had proposed the scholarship program as a way to turn our family's tragedy into something that could help other families facing similar challenges. The foundation had already awarded 43 scholarships and supported reform efforts in over 100 communities across 28 states. Our consulting work had revealed that Becky's operation was part of a larger pattern of corporate-backed HOA management companies that systematically exploited vulnerable communities for profit. Emma's research had identified a network of interconnected firms operating in 12 states using similar tactics of harassment, embezzlement, and intimidation to maintain control over hundreds of thousands of residents. The FBI investigation was ongoing, but early evidence suggested we'd uncovered just the tip of a much larger criminal iceberg. The legislation inspired by our case had been introduced in Congress as the Community Protection Act, requiring federal oversight of HOA management companies and establishing criminal penalties for abuse of authority in residential governance. Emma had testified before the House Judiciary Committee about the need for protection against predatory community management, her composed testimony helping build bipartisan support for the reforms. The bill was expected to pass with overwhelming support from both parties. During a recent consulting trip to investigate complaints about an HOA in Arizona, Emma received a case file that made both of us pause. The pattern of harassment and systematic intimidation was identical to what we'd experienced, but the scale was much larger. Over 2,000 families across 6 communities, all managed by subsidiaries of the same corporate entity. "Dad, this is what Becky was part of," Emma said, analyzing the financial connections between the various management companies. "We didn't just stop one criminal, we found the edge of an entire network." The new case file included testimonials from families who'd been driven from their homes, financial records showing systematic embezzlement, and evidence of coordination between supposedly independent HOA management firms. Emma's digital investigation had revealed online forums where families shared stories of harassment identical to our own experience, suggesting that hundreds of communities might be dealing with variations of the same criminal enterprise. "This is bigger than we thought," I admitted, reviewing the scope of the evidence Emma had compiled. As we prepared for our next investigation, Emma set up her mobile command center in our hotel room, multiple laptops, secure communication systems, and digital forensics equipment that would have impressed my special operations colleagues. "Ready for another round, Dad?" she asked, her fingers already flying across keyboards as she began mapping the corporate connections between suspect HOA management companies. I looked at my daughter, now 18 and preparing for college with a major in criminal justice and computer forensics, and felt proud of the team we'd become. A sign at the entrance to Springdale Heights had been replaced with something that reflected our community's transformation, protected by citizens who've been through hell and back with maps. It was Emma's idea, a reminder that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they work together and refuse to accept abuse disguised as authority. The old surveillance cameras were gone, replaced by community gardens and neighbors who actually knew each other's names. And every morning when I run past that sign, I remember that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to protect the living. Our story had started with a red violation notice planted in our yard, like a declaration of war, but it had ended with a community that understood the difference between legitimate governance and criminal exploitation. Emma's courage had turned her from victim to prosecutor. While my military training had finally found its most important mission, protecting families from predators who hide behind badges and bureaucracy, and somewhere in the federal prison system, Becky Hartwell was learning that actions really do have consequences, especially when you underestimate the determination of a father and daughter who refused to let evil triumph over justice. Epilogue. Ray revised 870 words. Today, Emma starts her sophomore year at Georgetown University, majoring in criminal justice with a concentration in digital forensics. The skills she developed during our ordeal with Becky Hartwell have made her one of the most promising young investigators in federal law enforcement, contributing to major cases involving corporate fraud and organized crime. Every conversation we have about her work reminds me that our family's tragedy led to her discovering a calling that will protect countless other families from similar predators. The toxic HOA task force has grown into a permanent FBI division, with Emma and me serving as senior consultants on cases involving community governance corruption. We've helped expose criminal enterprises in 37 states, leading to over 200 federal prosecutions and the reform of more than 1,000 homeowner associations. The patterns are always similar: predators who exploit legitimate authority structures to commit crimes while terrorizing anyone who challenged. But now law enforcement knows how to recognize them, document their activities, and bring them to justice. Sometimes I stand in my backyard looking at the community garden where Becky's surveillance cameras used to monitor our every move, and marvel at how completely our neighborhood has transformed. Children play in areas that used to be off-limits due to arbitrary HOA regulations. Neighbors gather for barbecues without fear of violation notices, and everyone knows they have rights that can't be violated by petty tyrants with clipboards and fake authority. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened because people refused to accept that bullying and corruption were just the way things work. Dr. Jessica Park had been elected as the new HOA president on a platform of complete transparency and resident empowerment, while Mrs. Dorothy Chen accepted the position of community safety advisor. The new HOA constitution included a residents' bill of rights, mandatory financial audits, and open book policies that would prevent anyone from consolidating power the way Becky had done. The monthly town halls Dorothy organized became models for other communities dealing with HOA reform, showing how proper oversight and transparency could prevent corruption from taking root. The Community Protection Act passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed into law last year, creating federal protections against HOA abuse and establishing oversight mechanisms for residential governance. Emma was invited to the bill signing ceremony, where she met families from across the country whose lives had been improved by the reforms our case had inspired. The legislation had already prevented dozens of potential Becky Hartwells from gaining power over vulnerable communities, while providing legal remedies for residents facing harassment and abuse. Our consulting work continues to reveal new aspects of organized crime disguised as community management. And Emma's research suggests we've only begun to understand the scope of the problem, but we've also seen communities transform themselves once they understand that governance should serve residents rather than exploit them. Every family we help, every criminal we expose, every community that reforms itself into something healthy and democratic feels like a victory for Sarah's memory and validation of Emma's courage during those terrifying days when we thought we might lose everything. Sarah's memory had been honored with a scholarship fund for single parents pursuing education while raising children, administered by a foundation that also supported community organizing efforts and HOA reform initiatives. The foundation had already awarded dozens of scholarships and supported reform efforts in over 100 communities across multiple states, turning our family's tragedy into something that could help other families facing similar challenges and creating lasting change in how residential communities operate. The Thomas Wright case had been officially closed with Becky's conviction, bringing some measure of peace to his family after years of uncertainty about his fate. The financial restitution from seized assets helped compensate the dozens of families who'd been driven from their homes by Becky's harassment campaigns, while several of those families had moved back to communities they'd been forced to abandon, reclaiming homes and lives that had been stolen by systematic intimidation and abuse of power. During a recent consulting trip to investigate complaints about an HOA in Arizona, Emma received a case file that made both of us pause. The pattern of harassment and systematic intimidation was identical to what we had experienced, but the scale was much larger. Over 2,000 families across 6 communities, all managed by subsidiaries of the same corporate entity. "Dad, this is what Becky was part of," Emma said, analyzing the financial connections between the various management companies. "We didn't just stop one criminal, we found the edge of an entire network." As we prepared for our next investigation, Emma set up her mobile command center in our hotel room. Multiple laptops, secure communication systems, and digital forensics equipment that would have impressed my special operations colleagues. "Ready for another round, Dad?" she asked, her fingers already flying across keyboards as she began mapping the corporate connections between suspect HOA management companies. I looked at my daughter, now 18 and preparing for a career in federal law enforcement, and felt proud of the team we'd become. The sign at the entrance to Springdale Heights had been replaced with something that reflected our community's transformation, protected by citizens who've been through hell and back with maps. It was Emma's idea, a reminder that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they work together and refuse to accept abuse disguised as authority. Our story had started with a red violation notice planted in our yard like a declaration of war, but it had ended with a community that understood the difference between legitimate governance and criminal exploitation. Emma's courage had turned her from victim to prosecutor, while my military training had finally found its most important mission, protecting families from predators who hide behind badges and bureaucracy.